The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
Today we're going to talk about three saints in particular from the Orient. And when we talk about the Orient, it's going to be interesting because when we mention that, that's not areas in our world that's highly Catholic, or that the Catholic faith was expressed often. And so it's going to be interesting when we talk about their lives and relate that to the Christian faith, how that really burgeoned in those areas in the Orient. The first saint we're going to talk about is Saint Lawrence of Ruiz. His feast is in September 28th. He's a martyr of Japan in Okinawa. And he basically is born of a Chinese father and a Filipino mother. And so when we talk about the Philippines, obviously we're talking highly Catholic, and yet Chinese, not so much, obviously. So in Lawrence's life, what would he have gotten from his Filipino mother in regards to faith?
Well, there would have been a very strong sense of faith. We see certainly in countries like the Philippines, as it used to be said of European countries years ago, that faith would even trump nationality, that faith is at the heart and the center of who you are. And so he would have grown up with that very strong, not only dedication of the faith, but that duty to live the faith. I think that's even more important. And we certainly then see that progressing out in his missionary work, but then also in his martyrdom, is that you don't abandon the faith. You live the faith every moment of every day.
You know, we're talking about the 1600s in the life of St. Lawrence of Ruiz. And so obviously life in Japan was different back then than in obviously modern day Japan. So people of the Christian faith were suspect, were going to be persecuted because of their faith. And yet we wonder, even in the 1600s, how humanity could torture someone because of a faith belief. And how we even see that today in some of our, unfortunately, Muslim countries, where we have that persecution going on because of someone's Christian faith. And how important is it for us to understand martyrdom in light of that? Because martyrdom is not something that is always prevalent today in the world, and yet throughout the history of the church, martyrs were abundant in the life of the church.
Well, I think, not to dwell too much on the geopolitical climate of many of the countries that we would be surprised have a growing number of Catholics, but just as you said, what is it about the Christian that threatens? Because after all, that's what is at the heart of all of these persecutions, when one feels threatened by someone else's presence. So why is there this threat from the Christian belief? And it is the Christian belief that all are equal, all are worthy of God's love, no one is better than someone else. There's also that aspect, the misconstruing of Christ as a king. So they see another sense of warlord coming in, someone else who's going to challenge the people to look at their own lives, but then also look at the leadership that's being provided and say, why am I just kind of acquiescing to this? Why do I not stand up for injustice? And then certainly we see the work of the church in terms of caring for and loving for and nurturing and nourishing people. So all of those aspects become a threat to a power structure in place. And that really is at the heart of why there is, I believe, such great cruelty, because you destroy your enemy at any cost.
Well, when we're talking about Japan at the time. Obviously, the emperor would have seen himself as divine, as a god, and so any reference to another god would have been not only suspect but against the emperor himself. And so there's this whole sense that Lawrence and other people who were martyred at that time because of their faith were tortured and ultimately slain, primarily because they gave witness to the eternal King, to Jesus, not to some human and earthly king. And how important it is for us as humans, but also as followers of Jesus, to recognize that our true citizenship is not in this world with earthly kings, but our true citizenship is ultimately in heaven. And even in our funeral rites, we use those exact words, that our citizenship is in heaven, and from there we await a Savior. And so there's that whole sense that Lawrence of Ruiz in his own life bore witness to that. We know that he was beatified in 1981 by Pope John Paul II, and then canonized just 6 years later, also by Saint Pope John Paul II. And this is typical in the life of John Paul II, and we'll talk a little bit about him in one of our segments. That throughout his pontificate, his long pontificate, he really beatified and canonized many people, and doing so in far-reaching areas like the Orient or Africa or wherever. The faith is there. The faith is growing. The faith is celebrated and continues to be celebrated in those areas in our world.
Well, I think we mentioned it in a previous episode about Marian apparitions and how people flock to the faith with these different feasts and these different apparitions. And it's responsible for, in some cases, millions of people coming to the faith. John Paul, perhaps more than any other pope, recognized the role of that in saints as well. You can't always count on a Marian apparition. They're in God's time. But John Paul, with God's cooperation, could lift up certain individuals like Lawrence to strengthen and fortify a people of this particular land, not to lose faith, not to lose hope, and to cling to the life of Christ and to see that there is an ultimate reward. So I think that does speak to the multitude of saints, but the vast array. They're not all European saints. We see with John Paul. They come from every corner of the world, as we see in this episode and the three saints that we're discussing. The other thing that I was struck by when you were mentioning that the emperor would have seen himself as the ultimate Lord, is that not the pattern of Christ's own being sentenced to death? What was he sentenced to death for? For being a traitor to the state. My kingdom is not of this world. We have no king but Caesar. And so these trumped up charges were because they were fearful that he was going to make himself king, and that it would, again, challenge the power structure. So we see that pattern replicating itself in Japan, and we see it replicating itself in many of these other countries that we'll discuss.
There's a quote that I'd like to mention before we take a break and go into our next saint, and that is by Tertullian. He made the statement, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." And so in the lives of these martyrs that we celebrate today, that is planting the seed in the life of the church, and that seed continues to grow. And how important is that in the life of the church for us to plant those seeds? And so the blood of the martyrs continues to grow the faith, in particular with Lawrence in Japan. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Light Moments. Here's Father Tom McSweeney.
Rita Churchilla moved to Millbrook, New York in 1989. At her regular job, she worked as a waitress. But on Saturdays, she sold homemade cookies, pies, and other treats at the local farmers market. You see, Miss Churchilla loved to bake, and as it turned out, people loved eating her baked goods. And 3 years later, Rita Churchilla used her life savings to open a bakery. She didn't get much sleep until she could afford to hire some help, but the hard-working and gifted baker did get customers who were loyal enough to stand on long lines for her pastries. So here's a recipe you might want to try. You combine talent, love for your work, and a willingness to take a risk, and add to that years of hard work. And with a final dash of good luck, you too can create something delicious.
This message from the Christophers.
I am Marino.
Yo soy Marino.
Marino, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Marino.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Marino.
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 Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about another martyr of the church, and that is Andrew Kim. And when we talk about him, obviously we keep in mind he is a martyr of Korea. And even though Korea is divided, we know that historically South Korea has a tremendous population of Catholics there. Mm-hmm. And so the faith is built on people like Andrew Kim and his companion Paul Chung Hasong. And what's interesting is that Andrew was a priest and Paul was a layperson. And so there's this sense that the Korean church, after the martyrdom of Andrew, was really built on the faith of lay people. Mm-hmm. And so there's that whole sense that they were instrumental in building up the life of the church, especially in Korea. When we talk about Korea itself and the persecution that took place there, we're talking historically about the 19th century. So anything in particular that we could share with the folks about what perhaps was going on at the time?
Well, we certainly see in the 19th century, in our own part of the world, we see the emerging of the Industrial Revolution and prosperity and growth, not so much so in the part of the world that we're talking about now. So there was still a great sense of poverty, a great sense of disparity. We hear a lot about that, this disparity between the rich and the poor, very prevalent. Again, hearkening back to when Leo XIII writes the encyclical Rerum Novarum, he's not speaking just to the United States. We tend to forget that the Holy Father is always speaking to a universal church and taking into account what is happening in far-reaching parts of the world, not just worried about our 50 states. So when he speaks about the need to care for those who are underprivileged, to allow people the opportunity to have a piece of land, to be able to provide for their family, he's not only speaking about parts of Europe, he's speaking about Asia and Africa. Very much a depressed economic area where people really are denied the opportunity to even provide for themselves or their family. That would have been the economic and the political climate that would have been part of the Korean life.
What's interesting is that Andrew was really the first native Korean priest. And so that in itself is significant, that here is someone who is a native of the nation of Korea, who feels this call from God, who responds to the call in the midst of this turmoil where the church is still persecuted, and yet decides to live his life and answer and respond to the call. And how important is it for us, not only as priests in particular, but as Catholics in general, to respond to the call of God, no matter what we are experiencing in our time and place historically, and how he so generously responded to that, but also gave his life in celebration of that as well.
Well, I think his responding to the call is paramount to the faith growing, even though we see in Paul and then their companions and others this great response by the lay people of Korea in fostering and continuing to nurture the faith. his response was paramount, because what often happens is you will have beloved missionaries, and the church is full of them. The courts of saints are full of these missionaries who feel that call to go off to a foreign land. But to be from there and to have others witness that it wasn't just something that some European missionary was trying to do for us, but that it had taken such a root that one of their own answered the call. That would have been paramount. Recently we've experienced that in the United States as the Southern Catholic Church has grown. There would have been a period not too long ago when everyone in the seminary for a Southern diocese would have been someone who moved from the North. And then all of a sudden there's 1, there's 2, there's 5, there's 10 who actually were born outside Atlanta or outside Charleston, South Carolina, but not necessarily in the beginnings. They would have been people who came from all over. And that was true in Korea, it's true in Vietnam, it's true in all these other parts. But for Andrew to answer the call, it really did open up the floodgates, if you will, that this is a faith we can live. And not only we can live it because someone else gave it to us, we can live it because it's part of who we now are.
Now, we've talked many times about the many saints that John Paul II has canonized. He canonized Andrew Kim, Paul Chang Hasang, and their companions in 1984. Not only early on in his what would be a long pontificate, but to celebrate the life of the church and the life of the faith in Korea. And so, there's that whole sense that God is present on every part of our world, not just in places in Europe that was highly Catholic, not just here in the States where we are free to practice our faith and the country itself built on religious freedom, but there's this whole sense to recognize the fact that the faith is planted in all 4 corners of the known world. And so there's a sense that the church is built upon these people who are celebrated not just as saints, but built on these people who are ultimately called to be saints. I go back to learning in theology how the baptized in the early church were called the saints. And many of them were persecuted because of their faith. And in a moment ago, prior to the taping, you mentioned how those that we venerated in the early church were always martyrs, because those were the ones who gave their life to continue the faith. And so there's this whole sense that we who are called to follow Christ are called to be saints as well, even in our time and in our place here.
Absolutely. Until the church was quote unquote legal, the only way really to have been venerated as this outstanding example was that you were martyred. You followed the life of Christ to the very end. We don't really develop a process of canonization until the church has been legal for a while, and then we recognize these good and faithful people who just happen to die of old age or illness. But in the early church, it really was that, and you had mentioned it before, the blood is the seed of the church, because they were living the complete life of Christ. They would not abandon the church any more than Christ himself would.
In closing in this segment, before we go to a break and finish our show, we want to remind the folks that are with us again that the church in Korea, even though it was built on this native priest, continued to be built on the lay people who were very important to the life of the church. And we celebrate that in our church today. We could not do what we do in the church without dedicated lay people throughout.
Absolutely.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
There is a place where a total stranger will give you their blood. There is a place where someone you never knew will save your child from drowning. A place where people from 7 states away will turn up at your door and give you food and shelter after a flood. There's a place where a person who doesn't look like you, talk like you, or dress like you will stretch out their hand and put it across your shoulders and say, everything is going to be okay. That place is called America, where we look out for each other, and it's up to us to keep it that way. When you help the American Red Cross, you help America.
Welcome back to our show. We're talking about martyrs of the Orient Church, and the martyr that we're going to talk about now is Andrew Dung, a martyr of Vietnam. You know, when we think of Vietnam in the lives of many people, and especially in the lives of people around my age and a few years older, we think of the Vietnam War. We think of the unrest that took place in that country. We think of the many lives that were lost and sacrificed. And so this time of Andrew Dung basically goes back to the end of the 1700s into the 1800s. And so it was really after the turn of the century that we see this persecution continue in the Orient and especially in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So what can we say about what was going on at the time during the life of this saint?
Well, again, I think we could say similar things about Vietnam as we could about Korea, a disparity of wealth, the sense of leadership that has a people very oppressed. Again, the message of Christianity is a challenge to power structures. Mm-hmm. This message not only of another king, but of someone whose message is equality and peace. That needs to be stifled as quickly as possible. You want to just keep people working for you. You want vast fields of impoverished people growing crops and tending to livestock. And if everybody plays their part, no one gets hurt. The problem is, as the missionary message comes in, and this message of lifting oneself up and following the life of Christ that makes us all equal and will give us all the reward of the kingdom, that is a great challenge. And so we see that oftentimes this sense of suppressing the faith had nothing to do with faith. It was about keeping people down. It was about not allowing their minds and their hearts to be opened and to be connected to strive for a greater sense of life and a greater sense of purpose. Mm-hmm. It was really out of a selfish sense of greed, if anything else. Power and greed. Keep them down, keep them poor, keep them working, and the very few in the hierarchy will control everything. It is that message of Christ that brings hope and peace to all.
And not to get political in this segment, but some of those things still happen in many countries in our world mm-hmm. today. There's this great sense of oppression among people where someone who might be in power and authority and living a life of extravagant wealth is governing people who are in abject poverty. Mm-hmm. So there's this total inequality. And you had mentioned that earlier on when we talk about the Christian faith. One of the tenets of the Christian faith is that we are all equal. Mm-hmm. We are all the same in God's eyes. And there's that whole sense, scripturally, that God plays no favorites. Mm-hmm. We are all the same in His eyes. And so in this whole sense in Vietnam, where the church is persecuted like other places in Korea, in China, in Japan, that there are people who rise above it, who celebrate the faith that was ingrained, whether at birth or through conversion, that they continue throughout this persecution. What's interesting in Andrew Dung is that he was martyred with 116 other companions. They're celebrated, canonized by John Paul II in 1988. And so again, we see this person, this saint now, who celebrated and canonized those who were persecuted because of their faith. And there's a reason why he has an affinity to that, don't you think?
Well, I think often we hear the phrase that we are products of our upbringing, we're products of our environment. To think that a pope would not be subject to that same. It would be false. We see in the young Karol Wojtyła, before he's John Paul II, someone who was a victim of persecution in Poland, persecution because of faith, persecution because of wanting to advance, wanting a better life. And some could argue that he never was able to get out of that model of persecution. We see it kind of advance into certain causes that he takes up in the church during his pontificate. But I would say certainly in the array of saints that he canonizes, we've just talked about three in three different nations, peoples who were under a great sense of persecution and who needed to be lifted up. And so I think in a lot of the canonizations that he did, it was perhaps whether he really methodically thought about it or it just was who he was, it was in response to what he himself experienced as a young man and then even as a young priest in the church.
I'm wondering if we put it in perspective for us here in the United States. We do not live under this sense of persecution because of what we believe. And yet how difficult it is for us to relate to the lives of these martyrs and their own story of struggle and persecution and torture. How difficult it is for us to relate to that, and yet there's this sense that we all are united with them in their struggle and how we could find strength in our own personal struggles. You know, we're probably never going to be challenged to deny our faith, but in other ways that sense of denial comes to us. And how in maybe small and kind of shadowy ways we do that with our faith. And we're all given this call in the sense to rise above that.
Well, I think for many of these martyrs, the experience of martyrdom and being put to death would just be that proclaiming the name of Jesus. The early church, you could not profess the name Jesus Christ. You could not profess him to be your Lord and Savior. That was paramount to death. Certainly, we would hope in our time and in our country, no one is going to be put to death or persecuted for saying, I believe in Jesus Christ. But then you have to break it down. What does it mean to believe in Jesus Christ? A belief in Jesus Christ dictates what I think of the unborn, it dictates what I think of the elderly, it dictates what I think of the impoverished, it dictates all of these different aspects, and then it gets difficult because it's, well, no, I believe in Jesus, but. Well, of course I'm a disciple of Christ, however. And we put all these little caveats on it that can slowly chip away at what it means to be a Christian, at what it means to be Catholic, what it means to be a disciple of Christ. So I think there are still no less challenging times ahead. We just fortunately live in a climate where we're not going to be put to death for it.
Well, we certainly thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
$33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.